This video will show how an extremely rich set of organizations, richer than many countries, are manipulating global organizations in order to implement globalist strategies. It will show how these globalist strategies are effectively and currently transferring wealth from the treasuries of nations into the revenue streams of private corporations. It will demonstrate how the globalists use a generic method to implement their strategies. It will demonstrate in detail how this method is being used to implement measures associated with climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on what we know so far, we firmly assert that much of the New World Order is already in place and has been for decades. At the very least, the World Economic Forum is just one of many powerful global organizations used and manipulated by the real leaders of globalism and the New World Order. The mainstream media is owned by the real leaders of globalism. The real leaders of globalism and the New World Order are the trillion-dollar global corporations, the trillion-dollar military-industrial complex, the billion-dollar foundations, royalty, and the super-rich. In preparation, we will first look at the simple, generic method that is being utilized to drive forward strategies that are making the leaders of the New World Order richer and richer, while making the lives of ordinary citizens of national countries poorer and poorer. The video will clearly demonstrate how the method has been used and is still being used in the fields of both climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. First, groom and then appoint servile puppets as leaders of appropriate global organizations. Then appoint further puppets, often groomed by the World Economic Forum as young global leaders in national governments and other global organizations. Create global problems that are designed to profit the leaders of the New World Order. Use the appropriate global organizations to determine global agreement on how to fix the problems. Create a sense of urgency and stress using the various puppets, but especially using the biased reporting of the mainstream media. Pull the strings of the puppets as and when required. We will very clearly show how this method was used to manage the issues of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. We will in a few minutes go into great detail on the COVID-19 pandemic, but as a good introduction, we will first turn our attention to climate change and some of the foundational tasks that have in fact been in process for many decades. Looking at the generic method, there is in fact a prior foundational step necessary. New global organizations must be created where no appropriate organization existed before, and existing organizations must be appropriately modified. Much of this organizational construction started in 1944. The World Bank was formed in 1944. It now works in more than 170 countries. The United Nations was formed in 1945. In 1948, the World Health Organization was established as a specialized agency of the United Nations. In 1948, an existing institute was modified into the National Institute for Health, and in 1955, further modified to become NIAID. Using a similar process of modification, in 1970 the CDC was renamed the Centre for Disease Control to reflect additional responsibilities. Further modifications were made in 1992. Having put in place these solid foundational organizations, the leaders of the New World Order could continue with Steps 1 and Steps 2. However, there were issues with the appointments of puppets into the existing organization, as such appointments often needed the votes of other parties, and thus sometimes an inappropriate candidate was selected. In addition, such appointments were relatively short-term. Longer-term appointments were needed that could be relied upon to consistently implement the plans of the leaders of the New World Order. This problem was addressed in 1971 when a little-known Swiss-German engineer-economist studying at Harvard was groomed into becoming the long-term leader of a new organization, the European Management Forum. Who did the grooming? During his stay at Harvard, he met prominent Harvard academics. This included Henry Kissinger and John Kenneth Galbraith, both of whom would eventually become frequent Davos participants. In 1984, another long-term appointee was made. Dr. Fauci is still in place today. In 1987, the European Management Forum was renamed as the World Economic Forum. In 1988, the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was formed as another arm of the United Nations. 1992 was a critical year. Having started the processes that continue to this day of Steps 1 and 2, now was the time to create a global problem. In 1992, the United Nations formalized Agenda 21. It was a global plan for sustainable development. After a considerable time, it was updated in 2015 to become the United Nations Global 2030 Agenda. It is intended to transform the world and continues to drive for sustainable development. The United Nations readily admits that this scope of work was not envisioned for it in 1945 by its founders. In fact, the United Nations has been modified to suit the aims of the leaders of globalism. And now the United Nations has set Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, and the UN member states have also agreed to climate action to limit global warming. The 2030 Agenda was incorporated into the Paris Agreement in 2015 and entered into force in 2016. All the preceding actions resulted in a tremendously important and productive period, 2015 to 2017. In this period, we can see the globalist generic method transforming into the specific method used to implement the Paris Agreement and climate change net zero. The problem of climate change had been created, and so too the global agreement of the solution. The mainstream media and the annual COP conferences created the sense of urgency and stress and sell the problem. However, there were gaps in actions 1 and 2. Point 2 was fixed in 2015 with the appointment of Dr. Ho Sung Lee as chair of the IPCC. Point 1 was fixed in 2016 when Antonio Guterres was appointed as the UN Secretary General. All actions were now in place for climate change. The implementation of the Paris Agreement involving net zero strategies are being eagerly taken up by governmental puppets. President Biden, for example, has set a 2030 greenhouse gas target. Canada has a target of net zero emissions by 2050. This decision was greatly helped when Justin Trudeau was reappointed Prime Minister of Canada in 2015. We can now turn our full attention to the COVID-19 pandemic and how the globalist method was executed. The first and obvious action is to appoint a puppet as Director General, World Health Organization. Step forward, Dr. Tedros. Dr. Tedros has a comprehensive entry on the World Economic Forum website. He was educated at the UK's University of Nottingham, and during the important years leading up to 2016, Dr. Tedros was working on Sustainable Development Goals. Following his nomination by the government of Ethiopia, Dr. Tedros was appointed as the World Health Organization Director General in 2017. He was excited to meet Professor Klaus Schwab and sent this tweet on November 25, 2017. Action 1 was complete. Much of Action 2 was also complete, but it is a continuous process, so other appointments were made in 2017. Theresa Tam was formally appointed on 26 June 2017 as Chief Public Health Officer of Canada. Perhaps coincidentally, Theresa Tam was educated in the UK at Nottingham University, as was Dr. Tedros. In the same year, Carrie Symonds was appointed UK Conservative Party Director of Communications. She was just 29 years old. She would later marry the UK's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Miss Symonds had previously worked for Mr. Sajid Javid. Perhaps coincidentally, he would later be appointed UK Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, reporting to Miss Symonds' husband. We can now move to the year 2019, where important steps were taken in preparation for Actions 3 and 4. The World Economic Forum held its annual meeting in January of that year. Royalty was there. The United Nations Secretary General was there. The 16-year-old Greta Thunberg was there. Bill Gates was there. When interviewed on CNBC, he stated that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had invested $10 billion in vaccines. The foundation received a 20-to-1 return of $200 billion. For balance, it must be noted that Mr. Gates also stated that helping young children live, get the right nutrition, contribute to their country, that has a payback that goes beyond any typical financial return. Mr. Gates also met Matt Hancock, who, at the time, was the UK Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. Throughout 2019, the health theme was kept warm, with various events, including the annual Goalkeepers, where New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern joined Bill and Melinda Gates. Further appointments were made. Professor, now Sir, Chris Whitty was appointed Chief Medical Officer for England, October 2019. Then, on the very last day of 2019, the World Health Organization announced that cases of a viral pneumonia had been reported in Wuhan, China. The year 2020 can be reasonably described as the year that changed forever politics and the relationship of governments with the people. That's a complex subject for a later video. For now, the globalist method required fulfilling the next two action points. Create the problem, but also create the solution to the problem. The World Health Organization quickly issued a comprehensive package of guidance documents relating to an outbreak of a new disease. The start of the definition of how to fix the problem. Now, to detect the problem was also quickly addressed with the issuance of the first protocol for a RT-PCR assay. On the 30th of January, the outbreak was declared a PHEIC, a public health emergency of international concern. On February 12th, the World Health Organization Director General appointed 6 special envoys on COVID-19, one of which, perhaps coincidentally, was a former special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Climate Change. On March 9, the World Health Organization called for an immediate injection of $8 billion for the COVID-19 response. On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic. Action 3 completed. The World Health Organization strongly stated that COVID-19 is not just a public health crisis, but one that would touch every sector. It called for countries to take a whole of government, whole of society approach. The approach should be built around a comprehensive strategy to prevent infections, save lives, and minimize impact. Thus, together with the earlier issuance of guidance documents, Action 4 gets a tick, although more work was needed on vaccinations. That was to come. In the meantime, Action 5, create urgency and stress, was played out. In an interview with CBS News, Dr. Fauci gave a seemingly calm assessment, but emotional comments were made, such as, "We don't know why they are suffering so terribly. They spread exponentially and you can never keep up with this tsunami. New York is terribly suffering." Politicians such as the UK's Michael Gove made statements that were inflammatory and incorrect, such as the virus does not discriminate. There also stepped forward the so-called experts, such as the UK's Professor Neil Ferguson. Professor Ferguson works at the Imperial College London. The college receives donations from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Ferguson's team at Imperial College London produced models that predicted the UK might face more than 500,000 deaths over the forthcoming several months if the government took no action, referring to lockdowns. The same model suggested that with no action, the United States might face 2.2 million deaths over a similar period. The mainstream media reported in the style of immature horror novelists. April was death, bodies stacked, mothers and fathers discarded in bags, piled onto refrigerator trucks in hospital parking lots, dumped into mass graves. People leaving this life without farewells, without a last look of love, without a touch. Action 5 was ticked off, but would be a constant process, as would Action 2 and the appointment of puppets in appropriate organisations. The reports being produced from the CDC would play a crucial role. The Biden transition announced Dr. Rochelle Walensky's presumptive appointment as CDC Director on December 7, 2020. The year 2021 is the year of the final solution to the problem. It was hammered home. Newly developed vaccines were to be used. Enormous effort had already been made on how to fix the problem. The guidance documents had been the start. The extensive and very expensive use of PCR tests to detect COVID-19 had been a major step forward for the globalist solutions on how to fix the problem. There was, and still is, a large debate about their accuracy, the high level of cycle thresholds used by testing centres, and the general expertise and efficiency of testing centres. One man that could have helped in this debate was the inventor of the PCR test and Nobel laureate, Kary Mullis. Very unfortunately, he died of pneumonia in 2019. So, having succeeded in making the PCR test part of the solution of the problem, and thus transferring billions of dollars from the treasuries of democratic nations into the revenue streams of private corporations, the next step in the solution, COVID-19 vaccinations, was hammered home throughout 2021. In January, Bill Gates stated that everyone who takes the vaccine is not just protecting themselves, but reducing their transmission to other people and allowing society to get back to normal. In March, Dr. Walensky said, "Our data from the CDC suggests that vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick." Also in March, Rachel Maddow broadcast that now we know that the vaccines work well enough. The virus stops with every vaccinated person. If a vaccinated person gets exposed to the virus does not infect them. The virus cannot then use that person to go anywhere else. It cannot use a vaccinated person as a host to get more people. Dr. Monica Gandhi told us that essentially vaccines block you from getting and giving the virus. President Biden assured us that fully vaccinated people are at a very, very low risk of getting COVID-19. Therefore, if you have been fully vaccinated, you no longer need to wear a mask. In May 2021, Dr. Fauci told us that when people are vaccinated, they can feel safe that they are not going to get infected. In June, he said, "We have all the vaccines we need. We just need people to take it. You want to be a dead end to the virus. So when the virus gets to you, you stop it. You don't allow it to use you as the stepping stone to the next person." The very next day, he gave further comfort, saying, "I think, given the country as a whole, the fact that we have now about 50% of adults fully vaccinated and about 62% of adults having received at least one dose, as a nation, I feel fairly certain you're not going to see the kind of surges we've seen in the past." In July, President Biden insisted that if you're vaccinated, you're not going to be hospitalized. You're not going to be in an ICU unit. You're not going to die. You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. And in December, President Biden focused on the unvaccinated, as did practically every other puppet politician. He stated that we are looking at a winter of severe illness and deaths for the unvaccinated. For themselves, their families and the hospitals, they'll soon overwhelm. But there's good news. If you're vaccinated and you have your booster shot, you're protected from severe illness and deaths. So, the strings on the puppets had been pulled numerous times and the puppets performed well. And Action 4, How to Fix the Problem, had received a big tick. As we enter the year 2022, therefore, the globalist method has essentially been completed, although some battles are ongoing and will continue. But nothing better sums up the current situation than the statement and question posed by today's Craig Melvin on January 13, 2022, when interviewing the US Vice President Kamala Harris. He stated that this week we saw a record number of hospitalizations, adults and children. We've seen the infection record broken. He asked, why aren't we doing better in the fight against COVID? The Vice President replied, people are rightly frustrated by where we are. But I think it is a great mistake to suggest that we have not seen great progress. Not everyone sees it that way. But if we return to the assertions made at the beginning of this video, it can be seen that great progress has indeed been made. Progress, that is, for the beneficiaries of the COVID-19 pandemic. In February 2022, Pfizer is forecasting a revenue of $102 billion for 2022. The company's revenue in quarter 4 2021 had doubled compared to the previous year. But it was not only Pfizer itself that profited. Shareholders also made enormous profits. On February 12, 2021, the Pfizer share price closed at $33.52. 1 year later, on February 11, 2022, the closing price is $50.78. The top 3 institutional shareholders hold between 65 to 66% of Pfizer's total shares outstanding. They are the trillion-dollar asset managers Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. The enormous financial muscle of the 4 largest asset managers is difficult to comprehend at first. But their very size makes them extremely influential when they sponsor political and financial decisions and when they sponsor political candidates. And because of the pandemic, their assets have increased enormously. For greater perspective, the GDP of all 28 nations of the EU last year amounted to around $15.7 trillion, while the 4 largest asset managers, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and Fidelity, currently manage a total of around $220 trillion. We also must not forget the foundations. As an example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has owned Pfizer stock since 2002, and as Bill Gates stated earlier during this video, the foundation also invests in vaccines. As to the super rich, the fortunes of the 10 richest men in the world more than doubled during the first 2 years of the pandemic. Their combined fortunes were worth $700 billion before the pandemic, but now are worth a combined $1.5 trillion. It is tempting to think that the military-industrial complex has not benefited, but the military complex has been making billions of dollars in revenue over the past 20 years. The US provided an estimated $83 billion worth of training and equipment to Afghanistan security forces since 2001. This year alone, the US military aid to Afghan forces was $3 billion. Of course, that stopped in August 2021 when the US military departed from Afghanistan. But there are always new opportunities. That brings us to the end, for now, of our case. But we would like to make some concluding remarks. These were our objectives. Just a few comments on two of the objectives. The transfer of wealth from we the people to private corporations, for that is what it is. Now, there are quite a few companies selling COVID-19 vaccines, so we just used Pfizer as an example. But the majority of that $102 billion will come from COVID-19 related products, such as vaccines. The money has been and will be paid by national governments. It is not free, as so many duplicitous governments have claimed. That money was our money, taxpayers' money. It could have been used to build hospitals, build roads, improve healthcare, improve pensions, and many other things. Instead, the money sits in the revenue streams of a private corporation. Many people are focusing especially on the World Economic Forum and less so on the United Nations as being the evil powers behind the movement to a new world order. That the World Economic Forum is a dangerous tool, there is no doubt. And this community will publish a separate video later in the year discussing the influence of the World Economic Forum. But for now, we quickly make the point that the World Economic Forum and the United Nations do not have the funds available to them that are required to influence elections, appoint government leaders, and dictate strategy. The trillion-dollar companies do have such funds and influence. So do the billion-dollar foundations. The United Nations, meanwhile, has a comparatively small annual budget of just $3.2 billion, and the World Economic Forum has an annual revenue of just approximately $372 million. The real leaders of globalism and the New World Order are a diverse group of sometimes conflicting interests. That is why we assert that we, the people, are at war with a chaotic form of globalism that is replacing national democracy and liberty with global authoritarianism. This community combines the topics of climate change, COVID-19 and the New World Order. If you would like to join our community, you can find us on locals.com. The New World Order. This link will take you directly to our site.